In just 23 seconds, $4.7 million in legal fees. Questioned, Pam Bondi didn't expect the backlash. She walked into that Senate chamber like she owned every legal precedent ever written, but her briefcase trembled in her hands. Cameras rolled. The nation watched. What did Bondi attempt to prove about prosecutorial ethics that only revealed her own fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional law? At exactly 2:47 p.m. on March 15, 2023, the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room buzzed with anticipation. Harsh, fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows as C-SPAN cameras positioned themselves to capture political theater at its most brutal. Pam Bondi entered with clicking heels and the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. Her navy blazer was pressed to perfection, but seasoned observers noticed the telltale signs. Papers shuffled too frequently, a slight tremor in her left hand, and that forced smile screaming overcompensation. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland sat like a predator who had already spotted weakness. His wire-rimmed glasses reflected the chamber lights as he methodically arranged his documents. Unlike Bondi's scattered papers, Van Hollen's materials were organized in precise stacks, each labeled with sticky notes that would soon become weapons of mass political destruction. The hearing's stated purpose was reviewing prosecutorial independence in federal cases, but everyone knew this was really about Bondi's controversial tenure as Florida Attorney General and her recent statements defending prosecutorial overreach. What nobody expected was how quickly Bondi would provide Van Hollen with the ammunition to destroy her own argument. Chairman Dick Durbin called the session to order at 2:51 p.m. Ms. Bondi, you've been vocal about prosecutorial ethics in recent months. Please share your perspective on maintaining independence from political pressure. Bondi leaned into her microphone, her voice carrying that prosecutorial authority she'd cultivated over decades. Thank you, Chairman Durbin. As someone who spent 8 years as Florida's chief law enforcement officer, I understand better than most the sacred duty prosecutors have to remain above political influence. The irony was already thick enough to cut with a knife, but Bondi was just getting started. Too often, we see prosecutors who allow partisan considerations to cloud their judgment, she continued, her confidence building with each word. True prosecutorial independence means following the law, regardless of political consequences, something I demonstrated throughout my tenure in Florida. Van Hollen's eyebrows raised slightly. He glanced at his notes, then back at Bondi, with the expression of a chess player who had just been handed checkmate in 3 moves. Miss Bondi, Van Hollen began, his voice calm but carrying the undertone of someone about to drop a bombshell. You mentioned prosecutorial independence. I'm curious about your decision in 2013 regarding the Trump University investigation. Bondi's smile faltered for exactly 0.3 seconds. Seasoned political observers caught it. C-SPAN cameras zoomed in as her jaw clenched involuntarily. Senator, I'm not sure what you're referring to, Bondi replied, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. My office handled hundreds of consumer protection cases during my tenure. Van Hollen opened his first folder with theatrical precision. Let me refresh your memory. In September 2013, your office was investigating complaints against Trump University for fraudulent business practices. The investigation was dropped just days after your Political Action Committee received a $25,000 donation from the Donald J. Trump Foundation. The chamber fell silent. Even the court stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. Bondi's face flushed red. Senator, that's a completely inappropriate characterization. Ms. Bondi, Van Hollen interrupted, his voice sharp as a prosecutor's closing argument. Are you suggesting this timeline is incorrect? Here came the critical moment. Bondi had 2 choices. Admit the obvious conflict of interest, or double down on a position that every legal ethics expert would demolish. True to form, she chose the path that would maximize her humiliation. Senator Van Hollen, I resent the implication that a routine political donation influenced my prosecutorial decisions. That suggestion is not only wrong, but offensive to every prosecutor who has ever served with integrity. Van Hollen's smile was razor thin. So, you're confirming the donation was received? Political donations are a matter of public record, Bondi snapped, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. But to suggest any quid pro quo is absolutely false. Actually, Ms. Bondi, Van Hollen said, opening his second folder, let's examine your own words on prosecutorial ethics. In your 2014 speech to the Florida Bar Association, you stated, and I quote, "Even the appearance of impropriety can undermine public trust in our justice system. Prosecutors must avoid any situation where reasonable people might question their motives." The gotcha moment hit like a freight train. Bondi's eyes darted nervously as she realized Van Hollen had just used her own prosecutorial philosophy against her. The irony was so thick that several committee members couldn't hide their smirks. Well, that's taken out of context, Bondi stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Every case is different, and the circumstances surrounding. Ms. Bondi, Van Hollen continued relentlessly, would you say a $25,000 donation followed by dropping an investigation creates an appearance of impropriety under your own ethical standard? The silence stretched for exactly 4.7 seconds. C-SPAN cameras captured every micro-expression as Bondi's face cycled through confusion, anger, and desperate calculation. Her papers scattered slightly as her hands trembled. Senator, you're oversimplifying a complex legal matter, she finally managed, but her voice quivered with the uncertainty of someone who had just realized they'd walked into a trap. Van Hollen wasn't finished. Opening his third folder, he revealed the kill shot he'd been saving. Ms. Bondi, I have here a copy of the initial complaint letter your office sent to Trump University. In August, it states that your office was prepared to pursue all available legal remedies against what it called predatory practices targeting Florida seniors. 3 weeks after the Trump Foundation donation, your office closed the investigation without explanation. How exactly does that demonstrate prosecutorial independence? The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. Bondi's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for water. The woman who had entered the chamber with the swagger of someone who owned the law had been reduced to speechless confusion by her own contradictions. The legal analysis showed, we determined that Bondi's words tumbled over each other as she searched desperately for an explanation that wouldn't exist. Ms. Bondi, Van Hollen said, his voice now carrying the gravity of a judge delivering a verdict, yes or no. Do you believe accepting political donations from entities under investigation by your office violates the prosecutorial ethics you've spent this hearing lecturing us about? 23 seconds had passed since Van Hollen's first question about Trump University. In those 23 seconds, Pam Bondi's carefully constructed image as an ethical prosecutor had been systematically demolished by her own words and actions. The chamber erupted in whispers. Republican senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while Democrats struggled to hide their satisfaction. Social media exploded immediately. Bondi exposed began trending on Twitter within minutes, with clips of her stammering response shared thousands of times. MSNBC interrupted regular programming to replay the exchange. CNN legal analysts called it a masterclass in prosecutorial cross-examination. Even Fox News, typically friendly to conservative figures like Bondi, acknowledged that Van Hollen had raised serious questions about prosecutorial ethics. But the damage went beyond immediate media coverage. Bondi's reputation as a principled prosecutor, carefully cultivated over decades, lay in ruins. The very ethical standards she had championed became the weapons used to destroy her credibility. Behind the scenes, Bondi's staff watched in horror as their boss imploded on national television. Sources revealed that her team had overlooked the Trump University angle entirely. Van Hollen's preparation had been meticulous. His staff had mapped every contradiction in Bondi's record with the Trump University case as their crown jewel. "Senator," Bondi finally whispered, her voice barely audible through the chamber's speaker system, "I believe my record speaks for itself." Van Hollen's response was swift and merciless. "Ms. Bondi, your record is exactly what I'm questioning." The devastating simplicity of that response would be quoted in political science textbooks for years to come. In 11 words, Van Hollen had summarized the entire failure of Bondi's defense strategy. She had tried to hide behind her record when that record was precisely what exposed her hypocrisy. Bondi's face went through a visible transformation in the seconds following Van Hollen's response. The confident prosecutor who had entered the chamber was gone, replaced by someone who looked like they had just realized they were drowning in their own contradictions. Her hands visibly shook as she reached for her water glass, nearly knocking over her microphone in the process. Republican senators on the committee began engaging in damage control mode. Senator Ted Cruz attempted to redirect questioning toward federal corporeal overreach, while Senator Josh Hawley tried to refocus attention on alleged Democratic prosecutorial misconduct, but their efforts felt forced and desperate, like trying to change the subject after someone had just confessed to murder on live television. The attempts to rescue Bondi only made her situation worse. Every time a Republican senator tried to throw her a lifeline, it reminded viewers of Van Hollen's unanswered questions. The more they tried to move past the Trump University issue, the more obvious it became that Bondi had no adequate response to the ethical contradictions Van Hollen had exposed. The hearing continued for another 47 minutes, but everyone knew the decisive moment had already passed. Bondi spent the remainder of her testimony offering weak deflections and circular explanations that only deepened her predicament. Each attempt to recover her footing only reminded observers of Van Hollen's devastating expose of her hypocrisy. During one painful exchange, Bondi tried to argue that the Trump University investigation was dropped for purely legal reasons. When pressed for specifics, she cited ongoing litigation concerns that legal experts immediately identified as meaningless prosecutorial boilerplate. The most cringe-worthy moment came when Bondi attempted to turn the tables on Van Hollen by questioning his campaign finance history. "Senator, I'm sure you've received donations from entities that might face federal scrutiny," she said, hoping to muddy the waters. Van Hollen's response was devastating. "Ms. Bondi, I've never been a prosecutor with the power to drop investigations. The ethical standards for prosecutors are different precisely because of the power you wielded." The distinction was so obvious that several committee members audibly sighed. Bondi had just demonstrated that she fundamentally misunderstood the difference between receiving political donations as a legislator versus receiving them as a prosecutor, with active investigative authority. It was like watching someone argue that traffic laws shouldn't apply to them because other people also drive cars. Social media erupted with legal analysis threads explaining why Bondi's comparison failed so spectacularly. The hashtag prosecutorial ethics 101 began trending, with law professors providing civics lessons about prosecutorial ethics. TikTok creators mocked her legal reasons explanation in viral videos. The platform pushed Bondi-related content to trending status for 3 days. News outlets played the exchange on loop. Throughout the evening, legal scholars noted how Bondi's own prosecutorial follow-up had been weaponized against her with devastating effectiveness. Fox News found itself defending the indefensible. Conservative commentators struggled to explain away the obvious contradictions Van Hollen had exposed. Behind closed doors, Republican strategists conducted emergency damage control sessions. Party leadership was furious with Bondi's performance. One senior GOP strategist told Politico she walked into that hearing room and handed Democrats a loaded gun pointed at her own head. Focus groups showed devastating results for Bondi's credibility. Even Republican voters expressed serious concerns about her ethical judgment. Among college-educated suburban voters, her favorability ratings dropped 34 points overnight. In the aftermath, Bondi's political future dimmed considerably. Speaking engagements were quietly canceled. Media appearances, Pam's confrontational affairs, where hosts inevitably returned to Van Hollen's questions. The woman who had built her career on prosecutorial righteousness found herself defending the indefensible. The cancellations began immediately. The Federalist Society removed Bondi from their symposium. The Heritage Foundation postponed her panel discussion. The Florida Bar Association announced they were reviewing past recognition decisions. Law firms that had courted Bondi suddenly found scheduling conflicts. The speaking circuit dried up as universities faced student protests. Even Fox News began treating Bondi differently. Producers prepared confrontational questions instead of softball interviews. The network's legal contributors distanced themselves from her positions. Sunday talk shows became hostile. Interrogations where hosts played clips of the hearing and demanded explanations. Bondi's attempts to rehabilitate her image backfired. During a CNN appearance, she argued that prosecutors face impossible ethical standards, which legal experts noted meant she was advocating for lower prosecutorial standards rather than meeting them. Van Hollen, meanwhile, became the hero of legal ethics advocates nationwide. His methodical destruction of Bondi's argument was studied in law schools as an example of effective cross-examination. The Maryland senator had demonstrated that principles matter, especially when applied consistently. The broader lesson was unmistakable. Confidence, without consistency, is the fastest path to public humiliation. When someone lectures others about ethics while violating those same principles, they create perfect conditions for their own destruction. The 23 seconds that destroyed Pam Bondi's argument became a case study in how quickly political careers can unravel when hypocrisy meets accountability. In challenging Van Hollen on legal ethics, Bondi had unwittingly provided him with the perfect opportunity to expose her own ethical failures. If this story taught you something about the importance of consistent principles in public service, like and subscribe for more political accountability content. What's the most devastating political takedown you've witnessed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This dramatized story is inspired by real events and public figures. All dialogue and specific incidents are fictional for commentary and educational purposes. No defamation intended, only illustration of how ethical standards apply to everyone, especially those who claim to champion them.